I'll keep going forward and it'll kind of give me some feedback as we go. So the first thing, to give you an overview, we've already touched on the learning objectives through the questions. I want to make sure you guys are flipping screens, right? Perfect. But we're going to touch on cultural elements that inform mental health assessment and treatment, interventions with the Hispanic Latino individuals, talk about the CFI, and then some school evidence-based interventions. It helps me to have, in addition to the learning objectives, to kind of have a roadmap so you know why we're talking about what we're talking about. We're going to start out with a basic overview of Guatemala. Some cultural factors that impact the engagement process, then values that impact engagement, values that impact treatment, and therapeutic elements of the engagement phase. I get bogged down in my favorite parts and get distracted telling stories from my experience at the school. And so I'm going to try really hard to keep myself well paced and leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So something else I want to know is if you guys could give me a sense. I'm curious, first of all, are families you're working with from Guatemala newcomer families that have just arrived in the last year or so, 2 years, last few months, or are they families that you've worked with or that have, multi-generation, or, maybe parents came and the kids you're seeing were born here? So some sense of how long your families have been here, and then also if there's a particular part of the country that you see a big influx from. I know in Houston, a lot of the kids I'll mention, or a lot of the cases I'll mention, are coming from Nahuala, Solola area, then speak Quiche department, Totonicopan. But if there's anything that, we'll talk about a couple departments in this very beginning, but if there's any particular parts that you're seeing a big influx from, I'd love to hear it. And I can make sure I can tailor it towards those conversations. So with that said,
I wanted to answer you. Sorry, Sarah. I'm gonna let you know the answer for the first question, just so that I can keep on receiving the next ones you ask. So from what I'm looking at this, we have a couple of therapists, whether they're clinicians or like in school. We have school psychologists, we have social workers, we have people that are on the mental health field, family counselors. I saw someone that said that they are a social worker, but they work with a police station. So we have a little bit of
mental health. Perfect. Thank you so much. That gives me a much better sense, because I don't want to get focused on things that aren't as relevant to y'all. Okay, I like to start out by saying my bachelor's degree is in international studies, and I did focus on Africa, but I didn't know anything about Guatemala when I started. I mean, not a thing. And so I like to start out with the most basic. I work with kids coming from the Northern Triangle predominantly, which consists of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. I've spent the bulk of my time in Guatemala when I travel. I had no idea until I started spending time there that there's 23 different languages coming from Guatemala. And you'll see this again in a moment, but the main ethnic groups are Ladino or Mestizo, or some of my friends identify as No Maya, the Mayan community, and Garifuna, and then Xinca, depending how you characterize it. Go to the next one. So the roughly, this is where I think is super interesting, and you'll see I have scanned in a handful of kind of different looking diagrams like the ones you see on the right. These are these one-page fact sheets that they sell and use in the schools in Guatemala. So this is actually how Guatemala is teaching their communities about the Mestizo, the Ladino ethnicity, the Mayan ethnicity. They or like how they characterize with photos and things that they see are important. So there's a couple of these interspersed, but I thought it was really cool to see how Guatemalans in Guatemala are educating about topics there. So that's what you're looking at. Roughly 60% of the Guatemalan population are of Mayan descent. The remaining 40% are Mestizo, as mixed European indigenous ancestry. The majority of indigenous people are Maya, with Quiche, Cachica, Lamam, Quechí are the biggest, and then the 8.6% is mixed of some of these other languages communities. 80% of Guatemalans practice some form of Christianity, particularly Roman Catholics. Only 13% identify as atheist or agnostic. This Latino, mestizo, no Maya is really important because my closest friends that I spend time with very proudly tell me that they're Ladino, not Latino, but Ladino with a D. And yet they all, while they're not representing and they don't identify with the traditional Mayan community that you're seeing, like the Mayan clothing, the Guatemalan traditional traje típica that a lot of women, some of the Mayan women will wear, they very much still have a different Guatemalan personality that is very different than Salvadorians or my families I met coming from Mexico or Honduras. So even though they don't all identify as Mayan, there is a very different Guatemalan culture, Mayan or no Mayan. On to the next one for language. We're going to, so Spanish is the official language of Guatemala. Only 60% of the population communicates primarily in Spanish, however. This is, well, we're going to touch on that, but 40% communicate one of the other, Amerindian Mayan languages. There's 23, as you mentioned, official recognized languages. This is one of the maps that I use frequently in my office to help kids or to get a sense of what languages people might be speaking, what departments are coming from. The white lines are the departments, and there's a department map coming up, but the language sections you see that they don't necessarily fit within the different departments of Guatemala. In the bottom, there's a Quiche alphabet that, again, they use in schools, and then a book written in Quiche. I have some of these to hold up as well. So a lot of the languages are not written, and what I find with my families is that my question tends to be, can you tell me all the languages you speak? And they then they'll slowly answer if they speak Cachiquel or Cachiquiche, but it's not, when I interact with them on my campus, it is not a big source of, it's something they're trying to hide often or very private about, but it is important to tease out because I find often I have families that say yes, 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 and answer in basic Spanish, and I'm not realizing that they've missed the primary message. Looking at just a really, really broad overview of Guatemalan culture. This is like the most surface big picture, but I think it's really important to note when we look at a map of Guatemala, it's very similar. I think even the different departments in Guatemala, I think, make an even bigger distinction than the different states in the United States. If you can flip to the next one, here's a couple of pictures of some different parts of the country. I think it's really important to note that it all looks different. The picture the picture with a lot of blue sky is from Esquipulas, that is on the border with El Salvador. Totally different feel. It's from Esquipulas, it's part of the Chiquimula, I'm sorry. It's on the border in Honduras from this last summer. The path leading up to the right is from a small aldea on the way to Totonicopan, and then you have Guatemala City. So you can have depending the size and the composition that a Guatemalan family is coming from, it's going to directly impact the level of education, the outlook, the experience, different types of violence from different communities as well, or different types of reasons people are leaving, depending on the community. Did you have any feedback on parts of the country that people were working with families from? Okay.
Yeah, we have people from Ohio, San Diego, and Maryland. Those are, and also Puerto Rico. Those are most of the states that were mentioned. And then in terms of the families they're working, a lot of people are working with mixed families, both newcomers and multi-generational. And I see that they also mentioned like the different, I don't know if tribes, the right word for it, and languages that their clients have. So we have a little bit of everything.
Thank you. So this last year, for each year, I've seen different trends in the families that have arrived. I get families when they first arrive in the United States, but often parents have been here longer. So a kiddo arrives to a family who's been here quite some time. This year, I had a big wave of kids that were coming from Suchitecas, and it was a completely different personality than the kids that I'm accustomed to coming from the Department of Chichicastenango or Department of Sololá. And I mean, Tuchi and Solola border each other, but it was as different as coming from, let's see, Tennessee and New York, just super different personalities, different needs, different behaviors, different challenges they presented with. But again, that's the point of showing some pictures to give you a sense of each community. Looks a little bit different. There are some areas that are predominantly Maya, and there are some parts, Chiquimula, for instance, really is predominantly Ladino. So that's continues on to the next slide with, it's a mix of community. The communities are really mixed, but I think it's hard to talk about Guatemala in any sort of absolutes because, for instance, Catholicism is practiced, but this is a picture of, or is widely practiced. This is a picture of the Iglesia de Santo Tomas in Chichicastenango, but the steps are used for Mayan ceremonies. So it's a Catholic church that many Mayans attend, but they also utilize the exact same space. It's for, this is facing one part of the Chichi market, but it's used by both cultures, and they're practicing both aspects of both religions or both spiritual practices. The yellow church in the bottom, if any of you have clients from Totonicopan, this is San Andres Chicul in Toto, and it's one of the more famous landmarks there. It's interesting too because the facade is gorgeous and the back is this like cement building. And then in the middle, there's a picture of San Simon Mashimon. This is this Mayan deity that some people love, some people hate. My very devout Catholic friends who identify as Ladino think this is black magic and evil. I think it's fascinating. Definitely a good read if anybody has some extra time to just pull up. But he's kind of like a Malverde. The Mayan shamans here are offering him cigars and some money. And there's a lot of the kids who come north, or the families that come north, will go and provide him offerings. So I've brought back a couple of candles, but this is something I'm very cautious to talk to kids about and to ask if they're aware of. Really important to some and really sensitive to others. So that gives you a basic overview of just, I hope, the complexity of Guatemala, and we'll touch on it again in different slides, but we're going to look at the cultural factors that impact the engagement of youth and families from like the Latino side. I was not familiar, or maybe I should have been, I shouldn't admit that, with the term ethno-racial trauma until doing some work with the MHETC, but it really does capture the Guatemalan experience. So the ethno-racial trauma is the individual or collective psychology distress and fear of danger that results from experiencing, witnessing discrimination, threats of harm, violence, intimidation directed at ethno-racial minority groups. This is so important, knowing that the Guatemalan Civil War ended in 1996. That's insane. That's so recent, which means the parents of the kids we see had an intimate experience, more than likely had an intimate experience with this on some level. Again, it was, depending who you talk to, and it's so raw in Guatemala. It's so new. There's not, I really like, my background's politics, diplomacy before I went into social work. And each time I want to go, is there a memorial? Is there a museum? And it's not quite there yet in the country. It's something that people talk about in whispers. And yet everybody, whether you're Ladino or you're Mayan, has a story of the disappeared and how it's affected them. My best friend will, as we travel through the country, she'll point out that, look, this is a community that's still built in a way with distance between neighbors and, corn's grown in a pattern that you can be hidden really well. There's still this tremendous fear. And so as young kids migrate, there's layer after layer of impact of the war, of needing to hide your language, needing to hide if you're part of a Mayan community. So I think that the idea of ethno-racial trauma really, really hits home with Guatemalans. With that, so there's challenges in the Guatemalan community. Discrimination on the next one, discrimination towards the Mayan community, oops, I have a typo, is still present in Guatemala. And like I mentioned, the memory of the Guatemalan Civil War intimately shapes all aspects of life. So here's a couple of pictures. Can you click to the next one for me? And this is just kind of these are some pictures, excuse my face on a lot of these. These are ones from some of my trips. The top two, so these are families that I have visited that had students at the school. So this is the young child made the trip with one came unaccompanied, no, both of them came with a mother. So the top two pictures are, these are both in the department of Solola, right outside of Nahuala. Turns out the families didn't know each other, but I mean, live in their terms extremely close in a windy, tuk-tuk ride, like 20 minutes. But I think it's, excuse me, really important to note that the family in the top two pictures is extremely, extremely wealthy by Sololá standards. The family in the bottom two pictures, the houses on the right, well, you can see the house in either, is really, really struggling and barely scraping by. By US standards, both are struggling, but it gives a little different perspective. The other thing that I think is really important to note is one of the questions I try to ask families as I'm getting to know, just to have some sense, because they're not, some will share that they struggled financially and they were poor in their home country. I often like to ask, instead of, it sounds like I'm putting a value on it if I try to, if I'm not real careful. So I ask if you've had running water. And both of these students of these families looked at me like I was just, had six heads. Of course we had running water. Well, the family in the top two photos had one toilet for their kind of like a family compound of all of these different, they had, like, you can see in the picture, like 6 or 8 daughters. And all of their families are living in very wealthy, built out house, built with money that had been sent back from family in the United States. They had this one toilet that they would bucket flush, they would fill up in the pila, but it was a porcelain toilet, doesn't actually flush, they scoop the water. And I mean, that was the image of wealth in this community. The family below said, again, the daughter in the United States said, yes, miss, of course we have running water. Well, they had a latrine or they had a hole in the ground and they had dug, so it ran out. And she said, yes, it's running. This is running water. And I realized, first of all, my questions, that when we talk about the CFI and about asking appropriate questions, my question missed the mark. I didn't know that until I was there. But life is so different. And then again, if you're living in the city, I've been in some very posh apartments in the city. And so the experience really varies, but this is what rural Guatemala, what I think of like the heart of Guatemala looks like. There is a lot of privacy around clothing, and it's this interesting mix of incredible pride and a lot of secrecy. One of the little girls wore her huipil, the traditional blouse, and her skirt to school for Halloween, and it broke my heart because it's not a costume. It's part of your culture. Some of our families, I don't have any students who wear traditional clothing to school, but some of the moms will. And I have a couple. Well, this is a gift from the bottom family. The family is very poor, and they do, you can see, hand beading in order to, they recycle huipiles and do some hand beading to accessorize. And then, so a huipil is based on your community, and you can identify where people are from across the country based on their huipil. This is one from Chichicastenango, those of you who have kids from Chichi, and it's one of the most expensive designs. They're open on the sides, and actually this one is being sewed to fit me, but it's a large blouse and then it's belted, but you can identify where people come from based on the pattern of their huipil. Then, so psychosocial, I'm gonna go to the next one for me. Psychosocial stresses. Now this says Latino ethnic groups in general, but we can talk about how each of these relate to the Guatemalan community. Poverty, inadequate housing, high proportion of single parent families, alcohol, drug addiction, different levels of acculturative stress, discrimination, low economic and low educational economic status. So again, this is why I think it's really important to know the part of Guatemala that your family comes from. Areas like Totonicopan, some parts of Xela, Alta Verapaz have lower educational access. It's rural. Actually, when I was in Sololá and Toto, I learned a lot about incredibly high levels of femicide, of violence against women, and of alcoholism. I've also worked with a handful of kids that I kind of suspected that maybe there was substance abuse in utero, and trying to piece together what's culture, what's lack of education, what's lack of education in Spanish and just language differences versus what's actually developmental differences. But there are regions that have higher rates, and one of my colleagues in Guatemala's comment was, well, there's incredibly high rates of sexual abuse and incest in certain points. I've seen some sexual abuse in little boys coming from Toto. It's not, you can't make that general statement, but there are just places where it's higher than others. Let's see. So the added complexity of immigration and newcomers. Here's a picture of a handful of my Guatemalan boys that had teamed up together at the school. The English proficiency level, if kids have gone, if parents have formal education, if parents can read or write, can you go to the next slide for me? There's obviously new systems for everybody to navigate, but they're complicated. I keep thinking as we've gone through COVID, how hard it's been for me to navigate as an English-speaking American born here with, with status, with access to resources. Systems are hard, right? Family separation, loss and trauma due to the immigration process, loss of status in the community, and self-esteem identity. Are you Guatemalan? Are you Mayan? Are you Quiche? Like, how do you figure that out? I think that every community has their, the hierarchy in their, how they identify, but the Guatemalan community, I think, is just a little more complex. The immigration, legal status, and mixed status families, I didn't understand what this meant until I started I started digging a little bit deeper. I'm seeing lots of families that, well, you have a child here. It changes the dynamic when you have a US born child with, or a US born grandchild in the case of one of my families. It just changes the dynamic when some people have access to resources and are the golden child because they do have this additional access. They're learning English at a different rate. Parents are frightened. It really throws the dynamic off. It also, over the years, I've gravitated towards working more and more, particularly with the Guatemalan population, because I think that they often tend to not be the best personal advocates or do a great job advocating for themselves. I think this is from the history coming out of the Civil War, being accustomed to discrimination, having less access to education. It's a group that I have to work a lot harder to make sure they get to court dates. They know their rights. I have to break things down a little bit differently and with a lot more patience. And so I think I've also seen more Guatemalans turn themselves over to immigration and say, I missed my court date. I'm just going to go to be deported, and not wanting to live with the fear that they could pick up. And I think some of that's also because they've lived in fear for so many years in different situations. But I think that it is a more passive community in general and needs slower, more patient steps on teaching how to advocate for themselves. So next, we're going to look at cultural values that impact the engagement phase. The first is confianza, or trust. So these are the same, this is the same family that I had showed earlier, but they are the perfect example of this. So confianza, or trust, it's a form of mutual reciprocity, having faith that individual will help you to the best of their ability based on the relationship. So this is one of the hardest families I have ever worked with. We were incredibly concerned about the little girl in my campus. She was rarely coming to school. I did so many home visits. I was so frustrated because I just kept running into dead ends. My coworkers still make fun of me because I had gotten so frustrated trying to express to the family. We're not still giving truancy tickets in Texas, but I was worried about her not coming to school from a safety side. And I was like, what is it? Why, is there somebody hurting you? Are you frightened to come? Or there was bullying, and my Mayan students are bullied. And I mean, we're a newcomer school, but kids, the same discrimination that was happening there happens here, both from the Latino Guatemalans as well as from often fairer skin, lighter features, or lighter eyes, as well as from Salvadoran Honduran. So I was trying to figure out what's going on with this kiddo, what was happening. She wasn't coming. We would beg mom to come in. I would go through WhatsApp. I would use anything I could use. Mom spoke very limited Spanish. always appeared nervous. I mean, all of the body language that really would like send up red flags from a mental health perspective, from a safety perspective. I finally got so frustrated that I pulled out my notepad and started adding. And I was like, do you understand? Because the school's still talking about tickets, that this is how much you would owe in quetzales, and how much did you pay to get to the United States, and can you afford to pay this in quetzales, and translating the money to what they were familiar with. And mom's eyes got big and was like, no, I have to pay off debt. I can't pay this bill as well. So turning it into a money and talking about, now there wasn't that much the school could actually do around money. But that was the first, we were trying to fight the battle of getting her to school. She did not see the need. Mom hadn't gone to school. She wasn't going to school in Guatemala. Continue to be concerned about her. Fast forward to when I arrived there, I had a local number. I'm sitting in a cafe and I get a phone call, and I said, is this Senora Sarah? And I was like, who in the world? How did you get this number? Who is this? Well, it was the aunt of the kiddo in the school. And the families had communicated, and the mom in Houston had gotten word to her sister, and she asked me to come to her house in Guatemala to approve that I was a good person and could help the family before they relayed the actual problem that was happening in Houston. It was the most complicated, convoluted situation, but it worked. And we found out that the kiddo was in big trouble, and I was able to get back and help her when I got back to town and bring some small things back for the family. But it took building the trust in all of these steps. And obviously I don't expect anybody to get up and do an international home visit. I was on the phone, I was FaceTiming with an attorney back here trying to figure out, like, we were in rural Nawala, holding up my phone trying to get some sort of reception to figure out what in the heck we can do. But it was just, more than anything else, it was sticking with the kid. I stuck with her the full year when she wasn't coming, when she was truant. It was showing up and not yelling, but being firm, and then coming back and saying, okay, I'm so glad you're here. I convinced her that if she did not bring me tortillas to school, I was going to go hungry. And so she taught me how to make tortillas out of Play-Doh, and then she would bring me tortillas to school. So, Miss Sarah's really hungry and really takes a lot to fill me up. So bring those tortillas. And it took lots of different creative solutions, but it took building the trust between family back there, who then could tell mom that I was a legit good person back in Houston, even though I had met mom here. So that's confianza on like steroids. Formal friendliness is personalismo. Formal friendliness, and this is another, it refers to how one behaves within relationships. So this is, I think, hard because it contradicts what I've learned in social work school. It doesn't need to, but it pushes the rigid limits that I learned to be a social worker and to be a clinician. It's this idea of, I think it's meeting the client where they're at, but demonstrating kindness, formal friendliness, it lines up well with the way I have often explained myself, my role to kids and to families as a professional friend, that my heart's in the friend space, but I do have boundaries. So, but this is also, it's pushing the limit for me of how important it is to sometimes accept a small gift. This family had made this huipil for me. They sewed me into it while I was standing there. So these are gifts from when I was visiting a family. And in the left, I'm wearing it back during our open house. And so the family back in Guatemala got to see that it was being utilized. Had I said, no, thank you, I'm not going to take it, it would have been so offensive. It wouldn't have been appropriate. It would have done far more damage refusing the gift than, kindly accepting it and appropriately within limits. And then being able to use it as a connecting tool when I came back has been huge. I worked with a Guatemalan social worker, a Mayan woman who spoke Quechua, actually lives and works in Guatemala. She's doing some work on the border in Huehuetenango. And she asked me when I was at a conference in Guatemala last year, why in the world I wasn't using a huipil. This is how you're going to build the kids' trust. This is going to be huge to show them that you respect their culture. I was very cautious because I didn't want to overstep and step into cultural appropriation and misusing a traditional piece of clothing. But she did make the point that it's how you incorporate it and what you do. I usually wear my Guatemalan nawal with my birth month, with my sign on it. different things resonate with different people, but showing that it has been very beneficial to be able to show, look, I care about your culture and I think it's incredible and special. The next value we're going to talk about is, I have trouble saying familismo. This is not the smoothest Spanish. This isn't going to get Spanish. This is the idea of the family. It's the clients focus on family, their community as a source of identity and support. I saw this a lot when I was in Shayla and they talked in Quetzaltenango. I got to visit with a group that was working with kids who'd been deported. And I think that this is incredibly important to take into consideration, but it's really important to also observe some boundaries, because I have seen, as I'm sure many of you, abuse at the hands of family. And this was something that the Guatemalan community, I learned in Quetzaltenango, was not prepared for. They were so focused on the role of the family and the traditional role of the Guatemalan family unit that they couldn't fathom that there'd be any negative. And so walking this line of understanding that you need to have, it might be really important for the whole family to communicate, to build trust, but also listening with a well-trained ear to make sure that it's still a safe relationship. But the role of family is incredibly important, and reaching out for the client to be able to reach out to those family and elicit their opinion and their expertise and bring that back and have that be part of the conversation is crucial. Finally, we're going to talk about respect. This refers to the respect given to the professional based on their position. I learned this early on when I thought I was being the cool social worker, the cool, this cool school personnel, when I told a couple of kids that like they could really use tú with me, the tú form, and it never worked, never did. They laugh and they joke, but maintaining, I have learned that there are some boundaries. No, boundaries is not the right word. There's some capacity that I am casual, that I'll sit on the floor, that we will share a meal, but it is important to them to continue that I'm still, like I said, a professional friend, an authority figure that comes with this experience. And I am still called teacher, even though I'm definitely not, and the social worker. But I think from what I am seeing, the healthcare workers, mental health, I'm either a psychologist in their eyes or a teacher. Social worker is completely lost. But regardless, I find that they turn to me for any sort of question. And it's just that sense of respect. So next, we're going to talk about cultural values that impact the treatment phase. These are machismo, marianismo, and fatalismo. So these are all just really important things to make sure that you're incorporating as you, and the client's perspective on each of these as you work with them. So the first one is machismo. This I saw play out a little bit differently this year with this particular kiddo. Machismo is the concept that can either positively or negatively impact a person's perception of suffering. It can encourage strength and the need for responsibility to take care for the family, or it can go either direction here. Can you click to the next slide for me? It can also isolate the individual through the belief that they need to dominate others and not demonstrate vulnerability. So I saw this really come to play with this kiddo who, Guatemala is spelled wrong, but he made me a Guatemalan flag for my office. So this year I had a wave of Guatemalan kids, particularly boys, young men, come without their mothers. So they came north with father, and it was this just really hard the kids were really struggling. And I had some Salvadoran Honduran, but it was really a Guatemalan wave. I had a bunch of girls actually who came with fathers as well. But especially the young men were trying so hard to be the role of, like, I say, hombrecito, like little man. Don't mean that in an offensive way at all, but just trying to, father was here. So they didn't actually need to be the head of the household, but it was this perceived need to take care of the family. And yet I had a bunch of young men who are breaking down because they missed their mom. They were incredibly homesick. They wanted, it would come in waves, and at times it would kind of go to a negative side, that it was in more of a domination. I'm going to be in charge of the classroom. I'm the one who takes the lead here, versus other times it was just an aching of like, no, taking on more and more responsibility. But what was really, like I said, was really, really hard is when it didn't allow them. It was so important to them to take on the responsibility to have this leadership role, how they viewed themselves, that they didn't get to acknowledge how hard it was, that they are 10 or 13 and they do miss mom, or they do miss tia, or abuelita, whoever they left behind. This kiddo would come in and visit, and he's like, you're my United States mom, you're my United States aunt, and just want to sit together. And I think my goal was to build up a space where the kids could be kids and be vulnerable. The next is Marianismo. And this is the female equivalent of machismo. It incorporates the concepts of saintliness, submissiveness, humility, and vulnerability. These two girls were, I think, the prime example of this, because my Guatemalan kids are some of the hardest kids for me to keep in school. And for the boys, they want to go work. For the girls, they want to take care of the home. And like, neither of these kiddos were ready to have families, but they saw their role as being providers in the home and supporting sisters in both of their cases to, keep the household going. So there were very strict family expectations on what their interactions would look like, what we would consider conservative. And even when I've had Guatemalan kids reach out with like help-seeking behaviors, it was, as an American, I was very proud. As a North American, I was excited that they're reaching out. They're saying they're having a problem, but in the case of some of these girls, it was a family. Like, this needed to be handled within the family, and it was too focused on themselves in the family's eyes. When we talk, like, it was just they're worried about themselves. They need to be focused on the home, on keeping it in the family, on taking care of things here. And so it wasn't the humility that they were supposed to practice, nor the submissiveness. The last aspect we're going to touch on is fatalismo. This is the concept that the individual cannot change their fate. Individuals may be less open to new technology and may have less drive to manage their own health care in favor of trusting a higher power. I've seen this come into play both from a medical side as well as from an immigration side. It's going to come into play a lot, but I had a really frustrating case that I took to consultation because I had a family that they told me about all of the incredibly brave ways they had avoided violence in their home country. And here they kept saying, well, it's just in God's hands if we go to immigrate, if we get deported or not. And it was having to walk this line between, yes, I understand that it is in God's hands, or that your belief system says that this is in God's hands. Let's look at what our options to help direct this can be. We know what the outcome will be if you don't show up for immigration court, or educating on the outcome if you don't get this medical treatment. I'll mention it again later, but one of my little girls came down with Bell's palsy, and she was living with older sisters here. The family had very firm beliefs about where it came from and how this is because she had a bad attitude. She was making ugly faces. She was talking back, she was scowling, and this was her punishment. But it was also like, well, it's happened. So what are you gonna do about it? They could not see any reason to get medical care, to like, well, that's how life is now. That's what she's gonna look like, and that's her punishment for not being cooperative. And so trying to educate around this, and in that case, we had to talk a lot about not getting medical care as medical negligence, and we're gonna have to report to me if you don't get the proper medical care for your sibling. So it's educating around the options. Next, we're going to talk about the therapeutic elements of the engagement process. This is when I wanted to know how many of you guys were mental health, because I think a lot of this is stuff that you're very well versed in. So I'm going to fly through some of it. Forming therapeutic rapport. Just know with the Guatemalan community, it takes so much more work. Like I said, my Guatemalan cases are the absolute hardest that I've had each year. It is like approaching so slowly, and it takes more time. And depending on your setting, I understand that that's not always a good option. It's just, for me, it's making sure I meet them the first day that I can. So when they're enrolling, I make a priority. If they're Guatemalan, I'm going to get my tail up to the office and introduce myself. And then again, and then maybe I'll make sure I tell them bye as they leave to the car. And then the first day of school, I make sure to check in and on and on and on in a way that would seem very overbearing for maybe a Honduran client who's a little more just a different dynamic. But it's like, I kind of see it as like building up the confidence, building up the self-esteem, and proving that I'm going to follow through and proving that I'm not going anywhere. Just trying to do anything I can to build the trust. I do come right out and say, I'm somebody that you can trust, but actions speak louder than words. So know that it takes, I think, more creativity to build that rapport with this community. Expression of empathy is, being empathetic and really trying to see the whole picture of all the different factors that influence someone's attitude. Transference and countertransference, context. This is, and I'll touch on this again in just a second, but context, knowledge of the potential cultural and community values. This is why I think it's so important to have a sense of where the country is located, what the departments are, what the languages are. Somebody might be the Quiche ethnic group, but not actually speak Quiche, but know that Quiche is a language. And oh dear goodness gracious, Quiche is a different language. Mom and Pocomom are different languages. These are such pet peeves of mine. And to know that they're different languages, different groups. I have had colleagues insist to me over the years that Pocomom is just an advanced version of mom. That is not true. So really having some context doesn't answer everything, but it just gives you that foundation of knowledge. And then considering the client's values and suspend judgment in order to understand the client and hearing how they view the situation. The next, just reminder on transference and countertransference. Transference is from the client side when the client attributes unconscious thoughts and feelings towards the provider. Countertransference is the opposite, when the provider's own repressed feelings in reaction to the emotions and experiences of the person's undergoing therapy treatment is related to who they are, to their ethnicity, race, and provider, ethnicity of the provider and client. So basically, what's happening on both sides. Get supervision, get consultation, and do a heck of a lot of self-reflection. Something that I've really noticed, and I guess again has made me a louder advocate for the Guatemalan community, is colorism is such a big deal. And there are just I won't say for whatever reason, it's just not something that I'm well versed in. I've watched professionals treat the Guatemalan community differently. I have watched teachers and staff and social service providers discount Guatemalans who have maybe more indigenous characteristics, and they're just pushed to the side. And so it's subconscious, but really examining countertransference is so important, and ensuring that we're treating our clients, with dignity and, with, I would say equality, but fairly. Impact of an intercultural relationship. So this is, you're going to have an intercultural relationship unless you're Guatemalan, and especially like Guatemala from the same community. And so figuring out how a provider like myself, who does not represent the community, is very clearly a white woman from Texas, how we can connect and make sure that we're not endorsing color blindness, denying the importance of ethnicity and race. This is where I said we'd come back to this overly focus on culture. It's important to know, it's important to note. But goodness gracious, coming from a different culture, coming from a different community isn't it's one piece of the puzzle. Right now, I also do some work with the juvenile justice system, and I have a case of a Bhutanese girl, a Nepali girl. No, I'm sorry, she's a refugee from Bhutanese, and she has been in and out of the system for, I think she's 14 now, so for 4 years, and she was 10 years old. And she's constantly, her case is brushed to the side because they say she's a refugee. There are still, like, that does not explain everything. I have seen Guatemalan kids with, like I said, exposure. It appeared that there was some developmental delays. That's not being Guatemalan, that's having a developmental delay. So making sure that you're integrating your knowledge of the culture to ask the right questions, but not skipping over real concerns. Feeling guilt, pity, or aggression towards the client. I would try really hard to make sure I am loving, caring for, supporting the Guatemalan community, but I'm not pitying them. They're incredible. It's a wonderfully brave, smart country community, and not feeling ambivalent regarding cultural experiences. I think, okay. So again, continuing, the client may demonstrate evidence of intercultural transference by demonstrating overcompliance and friendliness. And this is where we're trying to differentiate what's the personalismo versus what's too much and, transference. Demonstrate mistrust, suspicion, or hostility. And, a good clinician knows how you can confront some of these things in time, but cautiously. Deny the impact of ethnicity and culture, and demonstrating ambivalence. As a social worker, I focus on meeting the client where they're at, but trying to take all of this into consideration. So it's a balancing act, I'm sure you're familiar with. We're going to touch on briefly the cultural formulation interview. Again, this is another thing that until I started working with the MHTTC, it's not something that I was familiar with. It was things I was naturally doing, but it's a really cool tool that is included in the DSM. It's designed to help clinicians gather culturally relevant clinical information and will help to guide therapeutic alliance, rapport building, providing interventions, and connection to community care. So it's going to the next one. It allows practitioners to gain insight to these particular areas: cultural explanation of an illness, the cultural identity of the client. I didn't even mention this. If you aren't familiar, please, I have not included it very much in this presentation, because I haven't visited the particular community in Guatemala, but they do have a Garifuna community, like an Afro-Latino community along the coast. It is the same as it parallels the Garifuna community in Honduras. I've spent time there in Honduras, not in Guatemala, and so I don't have any photos, but this is a perfect example of how does the client see themselves? Do they see themselves as Garifuna, as Guatemalan, as Latino, as Afro-Latino? But finding out from them and us not putting it on them is so important. Cultural factors related to the psychosocial environment and level of functioning. You guys can read this as well. I don't need to read it to you, but knowing that these are things that I have naturally been including, but it's a really great list and interview to refer back to. The breakdown of some of the questions, so you can look at questions 1 through 3 of the CFI, define the problem. 4 through 10, perceptions of cause, context, and support. Self-coping and past help-seeking behaviors are really important for 11 through 13. And then what's affecting current help-seeking behavior. I think this also, these are just good therapy questions, to get some strong background. And there's a small screenshot of kind of what it looks like below, but this is in your DSM. So in addition, there is the CFI informant version included in DSM-5. It's particularly helpful. So I had to step back and figure out exactly what this meant. This is a version that parallels, it follows this exact same structure, but that you could be getting corroborative evidence. So you could be speaking with if the family, or if your client has brought in family, this is the tool to collect the same information from mom's perspective, from Thea, from cousins, from whoever the family, traditional or non-traditional. If they've come into the assessment process, you're able to have the same guided questionnaire to get a couple different versions of, or a couple access to a couple different perspectives. The there's also the CFI for school-age children and adolescents, supplementary module. I am running a little bit behind, so I'm going to speed up through our last couple of slides, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. Really briefly, it sounds like people are in lots of different settings, but for best practices for effective mental health service delivery in a school, convening a mental health task force, implementing a school-wide approach, designing interventions with cultural humility, and utilizing evidence-based models for mental health. A couple of things. I think a mental health task force is really, really important. What I'm finding on my campus, a mental health task force does not, for at least a school setting, doesn't necessarily look the same way as it might in a hospital setting. So on my campus, it's going to include our resource coordinator, our wraparound specialist, the assistant principal, a teacher who's really involved. What else? So maybe a community member. But it's a different composition. Let's see. When we're looking at designing a culturally responsive school-based services, we make sure that we're making sure things are equitable and inclusive for school programming, making sure that it connects with all all Latinos, all Guatemalans. The unique needs, our cultural needs, linguistic needs are addressed. Tons of visuals. Even my families that speak Spanish, my Guatemalan families especially that speak Spanish, need it broken down with lots of visuals. Conscious effort to address inequalities, making sure you're reducing barriers, and then recognizing the dissonance between academic approaches and community reality. So making sure we're really getting those basic needs met. Again, I think this is something that probably comes to everybody's automatic, the way they think about things, but a multi-tiered system of support is really, really important. So I have a few examples. You can go to the next slide for me. It's a multi-tier system is going to be universal on the bottom to do tier 1, implementing with all students, the entire school, or everybody in the organization, or all clients in the organization. So on my campus, this is social emotional learning. This is getting basic character education lessons out, talking about coping strategies for big feelings for everybody in the entire school. For targeted tier 2 is going to be those students who need a little bit more, clients that need a little bit more, maybe small group, maybe referral to grief support, or I have a lot of my kids who focus on socialization. So some sort of kind of learning positive prosocial behaviors, but in a small group setting, or, maybe a pull out from a class. And then tier 3 are really individual interventions. On my campus, I talk about a really extreme tier 4. That's a really, really intensive case management. That's going to be driving to appointments and just next level, but that's just kind of made up on the need on my campus. The traditional system is tier 1, 2, and 3. I wanted to use a couple of examples here to show that you could have the exact same intervention. No, you could be using the same style of intervention at all different levels. So we use some therapy animals on our campus, or we have 2 rabbits for therapy on our campus. For a universal level, I'm taking the rabbits in, we're talking to the entire class about, how to treat another living thing. We're not using bad words, we're using soft touch, we're, asking consent. Oh my goodness, we're asking permission to touch the animal. But this is an entire class. I mean, I'm sitting in here, I'm going around the circle in an elementary room. For tier 2, we're doing the same. I'm still using the rabbits, but I'm doing small group. We're talking about what it's like to be in a confined space. We're talking about how everybody, different skin color is, everybody's the same on the inside, even if the color of your skin, the color of your fur in this case, is different, but we're talking with a smaller group. And then this is one of my girls from Suchi on the right, doing some individual work with our rabbit, with Nieve and Noche. So it's the exact same tool, but customized for the different level. Same thing with the garden on our campus. We will do the whole school, come out and do a garden lesson, but we'll also do some one-on-one calm down work in the garden and some small group gardening that we're having to work together. So you can tweak it. Other interventions are the last two things, or the last thing we're really going to touch on is the culturally modified trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. That is a mouthful, CMTF-CBT. This is, if you're familiar with CBT, you have the trauma-focused component, and then it's culturally modified to include, well, Guatemalan culture. It can be used in schools with children. It focuses on kids who've experienced trauma. The primary goal is to alleviate some PTSD symptoms, emphasizing the role of the caregiver, working on emotional regulation and coping capabilities. And it's delivered in 12 to 16 sessions. This is hard. The caveat I'll give to this is that it works well for a clinician that comes in to the school. It does not work well for me as a school social worker, I need to have briefer interventions, but for somebody who's always there, or whose focus is solely therapy and isn't running other directions, 12 to 16 works. So it is culturally modified by including, or some of the ways it can be culturally modified is using dichos, proverbs that can be used during the psychoeducation or cognitive processing. And these are we're pulling things that are familiar in our Guatemalan and our family's cultures and relating them to the situation at hand instead of, does that make sense? Why would you use an American or US idiom that doesn't relate? I've been one of the things I was trying to talk to kids about was what bugs me. And, it te molesta doesn't have the same, I was trying to use a bug picture and it just doesn't translate quite right. Same thing during affect regulation, you can take in consideration words, meaning of some Spanish words that students use to express their feelings. This, just before I forget, something I've always talked about in the immigrant community, especially when you're doing guided imagery or a safe, calm place for EMDR, any therapy, especially with immigrants, you don't know what's going to trigger. You don't know the setting that trauma might have occurred in. And so letting them take the lead and letting them lead with what does help calm them. I remember working with African families and hearing about a babbling brook to them meant a place where they had seen bodies floating. Or when I was in Honduras, we talked about, if you talked about going to the mountains in this community, it was where everybody was murdered. And so making sure that you're really, if you're working on affect regulation, you're not accidentally sending them the opposite direction and re-traumatizing. So cuentos, short stories, cognitive coping, can teach youth ways to modify behaviors in a more adaptive structure with things that culturally relate. So with that, I think we're ready for questions. What can I tell y'all, or what questions have y'all gotten?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Our first question is, where can you find the CFI?
In the DSM. This is in the back of the DSM. DSM-5, Diagnostic Statistic Manual. Oh, this is on this last screen with my contact information. I found this in my paperwork. This is the emotions that they're teaching. This is the picture they're using to teach emotions in schools in Guatemala. And I thought it was interesting and also frustrating to me that all of the kids are, virtually all the pictures are white. So don't necessarily reflect the kiddos, but you can see the emotions that they place the emphasis on.
Thank you, Sarah. The next one says, from mental health perspective, do you feel that it improves the relationship in multi-generational families when the US-born children are able to visit their parents' native land?
Purely speaking from my personal opinion, nothing grounded in evidence, because I don't have any evidence on the subject. I would think so. I sat out when I came back from my last trip, I was sitting next to a man and his adult son, and the adult son was visiting Guatemala for the first time. The man was born in Guatemala, son born in, might have been Ohio. I don't remember now. Goodness. They had visited Tikal. They were doing touristy things, but it was from what they were sharing of their trip, it had been a very, very special, very meaningful trip to get go back and reflect. So I would think so. What else?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question had another part. It says, the reason is that we see a huge cultural disconnect within multi-generational families. That's why she was asking.
That makes sense to me. And I don't have a lot of evidence on the Guatemalan side. I know just in looking at my friends and communities that they've come from. Yes, I mean that you lose your traditions the longer that you're living in a different community, and so having those, being able to visit those roots and understand the meaning and what makes it so special, I would imagine could strengthen some of that. But also, okay, so that does remind me, that meeting I had when I was in Shayla, I had visited. I cannot remember. Come back to me later. It was an organization that was receiving Colectiva Vida Digna. That's what it was. It was receiving returnees, deportees, and I got, like, honestly, I got mad when I was there because they were telling me all about the Mayan, the tradition, the culture, and they insisted to me that the only reason kids went north, the only reason they left, was because of iPhones, and PlayStations. And I mean, I was very polite. There was a shaman there who was on the staff who was speaking to me, along with like 2 or 3 other staff members, and I was with my best friend, and I was very polite in the meeting. And I went back and broke down. We sat in the center of the Parque Central of Shayla, and I just cried and cried and cried because I couldn't even find the words. I had been working with a kid from Shayla who was facing deportation, who had fled because of sexual abuse in the family, and I couldn't grasp how things had been minimized to a if only you had known the culture, if only you had known, if only these kids knew the culture, they would never go north, if only they would understand their Mayan roots. And so I think that there's always a conflict across any generation, across any community, that traditions, there's family traditions, there's cultural traditions, and then things change. I mean, there's that mix, right? We're moving forward, and it's important to have a foot in both worlds. But I think it's also a conversation about, I try to, like, normalizing child development with all of our families, regardless of where they're from, that share your values, but also cell phones are part of life now. I mean, it's not how you model that, model the values you want your children to have, share what's important, but know that, it's a combination.
Thank you, Sarah. Another question says, how do you balance wanting to respect traditional Guatemalan cultures about things like gender identity, sexual orientation, etc., with wanting to advocate?
So the approach that I've taken across, so when I started working, I was focusing on the East African communities. I was working with a lot of Congolese, Banyamulenge, Burundian groups, and I was stepping into areas that had strict cultural expectations. And so 10 years ago, I started back then kind of setting my personal tone, and it aligns with my social work career, as focusing on self-determination and safety. And like I need the client to be safe in their family, in their family system, but I need them to feel safe in in their body, in their experience as well. So whether we're talking about birth control and like contraceptives, or we're talking about gender identity expression, I walk a careful line, working really hard not to put my own. I think I'd probably land on the more liberal, very open-minded side, but I go back to ask what this means to you, what this means to your community, how would that be perceived in your community, what would the consequences, if you're telling me that it's going to be really negatively received, what would that be like? Let's process that. What are you comfortable with? What are you comfortable with right now? Maybe you would feel differently. Maybe if you're trying to figure out your own gender identity, focus on how you could express that would align with just finding your comfort level. And then I always offer, especially with youth, like to how we're going to talk to your family about that. I'll sit with you, we'll role play, we'll go through the conversation more. I say I've seen some older teenagers who've had conflicts with the families and move out, run away because of, their gender identity. But often, especially for my younger kids or kids who, if they've been separated, the biggest conflict I see comes when they're living with siblings or non-biological parents, which is more common in my experience in the Guatemalan community than others. I think the younger they are, the more supportive the biological parent is and the better chance we have to help work through that. But it's at the kid's pace as long as they're safe. That kind of goes out the window if we're talking about self-harm or suicidal ideation. Self-harm I'm not as urgently concerned about, but really asking where they're at and what it means to them. I'm sorry, I give very long answers.
Thank you for that, Sarah. Next one says, do you find the ACEs helpful to build evidence for stress, or what tests do you suggest?
Ooh, that's a good question. Okay, well, to assess for stress, I don't, this is not going to be the right evidence-based answer for you guys. Honestly, I go through my own checklist in my mind. Like I know what I listen. I sit down and ask what's going on. Tell me about it. And because of the context I have, because of how I've educated myself, and to be clear, like everything I've learned has been out of college. Everything I've learned has been like me seeking out, like, let me read this, let me watch this movie, let me go, travel around the country. Each of these trips. So when I went to Guatemala the first time, I did not speak a word of Spanish when I started. I went to Guatemala to take Spanish classes. My teacher became my best friend. I've taken 8 trips over the past 6 years. I'm losing it that I'm not going to be going in the next month like I typically do. But I guess I immersed myself, and so I have this context. So I've learned how to kind of filter somewhat of what I'm hearing, I guess, and then just ask questions. And so I think ACEs are great. When I talk about trauma, I utilize them all the time as a great educational, a great way to connect everything. I guess the easiest answer though is like, I know if my families are immigrating, tough stuff has happened. And so there are some things I will ask about, who's living, tell me about where, getting a biopsychosocial like kind of background history. Capturing the ACEs I don't necessarily do, but they are things I'm listening for because they're typical things you would collect in a history. If people are detained, if people are incarcerated, if if there's alcoholism in the family. So yes, it helps. I think it depends what lens, like what how your brain works. But yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. They're also asking regarding trauma. I've had the experience of parents telling child to just move on rather than work through the trauma. Have you ever experienced this?
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes, so I would be curious if you're ever able to pull out where you think that comes from. I have seen parents, one of the most poignant examples for me was actually a family from Nicaragua that insisted the child was fine, just needed to move on, let it go. And as we talked, we learned about her tremendous trauma. What I often see is families who minimize things. Obviously, they're doing, every behavior is for a reason, but I found that it's because they're not understanding what we as professionals know about the impact of trauma on children and different reactions to trauma. And they're saying, but like, look at this event. If you think your father beat you, your father was doing this horrific abuse towards me, and what you got was tiny compared to what I got, or what you've been exposed to. I hear that a lot when people talk about the war, like, okay, but I lived through the Civil War, and yeah, there's some gang violence, but compared to what I was dealing with. And so minimizing it because of their own experience, also minimizing it because of not being able to cope with it themselves. I've seen trauma, especially when it's around a loss or like a murder of a family member or a sudden death of a family member. It's trying to just move on because they can't handle processing it themselves. I know that I think adults so often forget how kids cope, and that we all hurt, and that we're expecting something of kids that, we might not be able to do ourselves so easily. And also there's just fear around what you're going to share, what kind of trouble is it going to get the family into. And I did a whole interview yesterday on help seeking parents behaviors and mothers getting child health care, and like what barriers they were reaching or hitting. And I really came down to time, and like if a kid is constantly bringing, not like constantly, it sounds so negative, but if it's frequently revisiting this traumatic experience, and the mother, the father, the family, she's like, we have things to do. Like, this is not in the forefront of my mind. We're compartmentalizing and moving forward. It reminds me of getting healthcare. If it's not right in front of you, if you don't understand how much it hurts, then you don't always seek the help, and you kind of push it aside. In my experience.
Thank you. That was insightful. The next one says, what was the name of the, I assume they try to spell clan. You explained the term Ladino again. Is this more of a contemporary term?
So it's used interchangeably with mestizo. It's the idea of it's the distinction between I have Spanish ancestry versus my family is Mayan. What someone explained to me, and so okay, when I was putting this together, thank you for asking, whoever asked this, because this was something I was really trying to navigate closely in this presentation. Even the number of languages and how the languages are described, I have different numbers, different places. There seems to be this, like, there are 20 some languages in Guatemala. I see 22 some places, I see 23 other places. The way ethnic groups are broken down, sometimes Garifuna, Xinca, Mestizo / Ladino, and Maya it's 4, sometimes they say 3. It's just this like fluid, it doesn't seem as concrete as we find some places. And it's very, very your experience. So my friends have made such a big deal. Like at the language school I started out going to, it was, we are Ladino, because it's this sense of fair skin, it's having European ancestry, right? So what they explained to me also was that if you have, like, you're a Mayan if your family is 100% Mayan. As soon as your family is mixed, then you become mestizo, which is a contradiction, because on the one hand it's this European higher, on the other hand it's this mix that you think would kind of negate some of that. It's complete. It confuses me, but I think it's your lived experience. But the Ladino is definitely the tracing your family back to Spain ultimately, and being able to say like we're part of the Spanish lineage. My other really, really good friend there very proudly says she is Ladino. She has a lot of Mayan characteristics. And when I asked her her full name one time, her last name's Mayan, like very obviously Mayan. It's like Puac or something. And I said, but does that mean you have a Mayan parent? And she's like, well, maybe. And it's safer to identify as Ladino or as mestizo. It's just the other. The non-purely Mayan. And there is still one of the big scandals at the school I took lessons at. The large family owned the whole school. And one of the Ladino younger sons married a Mayan woman. And I mean, it was a scandal. So the idea of Ladino and Mayan marrying together and having children, it happens, but it was controversial at that point. What else?
That was actually very interesting.
This is very much like, so I know these things not from textbook, but from lived experience. And again, if you ask, I think you could ask 5 Guatemalans and they would give you slightly different answers. I am super nosy and ask every Uber driver and everybody else. And like I ended up talking to a couple coyotes that way and just being connected with people because I have really honest conversations. I think they feel sorry for me as I fumble through in Spanish, but know that like these are different this is the first person experience or this is the first person's like account that I'm repeating, but it might not exactly line up with an academic journal. This is what I get on the ground.
Thank you for sharing all that. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. So the next one says, would you like to hear a bit more about identification piece and examples Garifuna in Honduras versus Guatemala? She mentioned this before getting into CFI, and she stated she forgot to bring this up or able to dive further in due to time. Not sure what she means with that question.
I get really excited talking about details of Guatemala, and then I don't stick to this. I think probably the Garifuna community. Okay, I know what you're talking about. So it's just to keep in mind the complexity with how people identify. For instance, just give my own example. I born and raised in Texas, and my family has a long history in Texas. I went to Texas A&M, so in theory, you would assume I'm fairly conservative. I pick and choose the way I share my identity, because if I say I'm an Aggie, people pull back. And you share different. It's all true. I don't identify as a daughter of the Republic, of the Texas Republic, because it's not a big part of, it has a certain connotation. So I think it's so important to ask people, especially immigrants, like how they see themselves. The Garifuna community is, you have black skin, you have dark skin. It's influenced by, or it's the community that came in with like slave trade. And it's on the coast around Livingston. It's much smaller than the community in Honduras that's in Roatan, a lot of the cruise destinations. But the Garifuna community in both locations is incredibly marginalized. It is so my focus in the last years have been working with the Garifuna people and with the Mayan communities, because I just don't see other people picking up the cause the same way. They're overlooked, and the racism within the country is immense. And so noting and asking, how do you identify yourself? Because I've had Garifuna kids who try really quickly to identify as Black American, because it just seems safer than identifying as Afro-Latino. It's also a community that I worry about as far as like having problems with the police, because they look like Black Americans, like African American, and it could so easily, and don't speak a word of English. They speak Garifuna. Oh my gosh. Also, some only speak the language Garifuna. And if someone is trying to speak to them in English because they appear to be, born in the United States, stereotypical features, then they're not going to understand a word you're saying, because you need either Spanish or Garifuna. So it's a community that I also has incredibly high rates of domestic violence. In the Guatemala side, there's parts that have a little more cartel. Yeah, there's cartel involvement right around Puerto Barrios and its various places. So it's a community with lots of intersection with violence that needs some extreme trauma care and trauma help. But coming back to the point, it's making sure you're asking how someone identifies, if they want to identify as Afro-Latino, if they want to identify as Garifuna, if they want to identify as Guatemalan. Most of my Garifuna kids, the Hondurans Garifuna identify as Honduran. The Guatemalan Garifuna identify as Garifuna. I don't know why. It's just what I've encountered.
Thank you, Sarah. Another question says, hi, this is Lona Soward, MD. What do you believe is the best way to communicate with family members that do not share the same values as the US on educating?
So I go at this in all different ways. I was on an email thread right before this talking about how I want to bring in some budgeting conversations for little guys next year. I try to find things. Part of being trauma sensitive, being trauma informed, being respecting cultural humility, is finding things to bridge that gap and finding things that are meaningful to our clients. So talking about educating on the education laws. explaining that, goodness gracious, I do not want to bring more attention or more trouble to your family. And so please, please, please don't make me report this for truancy, for the family not following through. So I try to do the safety side. I explain to families that the safest place your kid can be is at the school, assuming your school's being taken care of, But I see a lot of the other aspect that worries me about my Guatemalan community here is I think there's higher rates of labor trafficking, sex trafficking. I can't protect you when you're not here. And that's what I told the little girl over and over, was that when you're in the school, Miss Sarah can keep her eyes on you and I know that you're okay. When you're outside, if your mom's not home, your dad's not home, you're not old enough to work. If you're 12, I had one girl who was cleaning a club. That's not safe. So I come at it from the safety side. I also come at it from a lot of my families. A lot of the Guatemalans talk very much about this is a temporary move here. And so I understand if physics isn't your goal, but we got to learn English. You're going to make so much more money when you go back to Guatemala. If you go back to Guatemala, you can send more money back if you learn English. I had a couple of families who were planning to self-deport pre-COVID. And my conversation with them was, get the good out of our school, use our mental health, get your glasses, learn about everything you can. I know that your future plans don't look the same as mine may have. Maybe they do, but they might not. But let's think about how you can utilize this time. And so I try to come at it multi-pronged. Like, let's learn about things that appeal to you. Let's learn about, get all that free English that you possibly can, get that access to resources, learn, because also tourism is so huge in Guatemala, aside from COVID. And like, you can have such a better job if you can do such good work with tourists when you come through, if you go back. So like, let's use this to your advantage. And then talk about connection and, teaching other people about your community. I don't want to put too much. I don't like the overrepresentation of you are Guatemalan, so it's not your duty to educate others, but there is some like show us what you love about your country. So I come at it multi-pronged. And I'm pretty honest with families and just level with them after a while that you need to be here. And it's going to hurt your immigration. If you're actually in removal proceedings and you're not going to school, that's going to hurt. So get your tail to school. And what can I do to make that happen? Anything else?
That was our last question. I don't know if you want to say something before I wrap up.
No, I am so touched that so many people have an interest in learning about working with Guatemalans. It makes my heart happy because I love the community so much. I was on the phone with my best friend and just yesterday telling her that I was going to do this, and she was like, wow, you didn't even know where we were on the map when you first came, which is so embarrassing in hindsight. So I'm so rejuvenated to see such interest, and thank you for so many good questions. I wish I could see people. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Sarah, for another amazing presentation. I really enjoy your webinars. And we actually had a webinar on Guatemalan community a couple of weeks ago as well. So we're definitely really happy that people are showing their interest in and that we get to learn as well during these webinars. I wanted to remind everybody a couple of points. Number one, you're going to receive a certificate of participation, and it's going to be sent through email. So the email that you use for registration should be the email you check for that certificate. And you're going to also receive the link that we're looking at right now for SurveyMonkey. That's our evaluation for this webinar, which is really important for us that you make sure you fill out, because it not only let us know how it was, but it also help us making more events like this one and definitely getting to know more about all these communities. So once again, I wanted to thank you, Sarah, and everybody else for joining us today. And I hope that everybody has a great day. Thank you.